organizations, no one sees the shirt and goes, "Oh, Iraq veterans against the war. Wow, that's so proud." No, it's like I heard a veteran speak, or I met a veteran who was wearing, happened to be wearing that shirt.
Exactly. Yes.
You know, and
it has to be a person of face.
That's how it always is. You know, and you have to be comfortable with the people you're dealing with. And so that's like we were able to do that today in a way that I don't want to say we never have before. We've never done it deliberately like that.
It's very, very successful. Very successful.
Yeah, outstanding.
We still got to cover a lot of important shit, but an enthusiastic crowd can be a blessing and a curse.
Yeah, I think probably there would have been more people there if there had been a larger room.
Oh no, I don't think anybody left because it was full. I think it was about the right size room for the crowd that we had.
Yeah, but I know somebody went over there and saw how full it was.
Oh really? Oh, just because they were still deciding between that and something else.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see what happens tomorrow. Tomorrow's going to be nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
Hey, can I take a look at that? The ROE?
Yeah,
I've never seen it before.
That's at what time? At 2?
2 tomorrow, man.
Yeah,
that specific card.
Yeah.
With my damage on it and the line cut off the bottom. That card is like famous now.
Yeah, yeah.
That is a historical document.
I don't think there'll be too many people at mine.
See the back where it's the last sentence at the very bottom.
Will remain in effect until your commander tells you otherwise, or whatever. Right?
Yeah, it's something to that effect. But it's really ironic. Right. Until your commander gets his head out of his ass. There's that sentence there anyway you want. But that's like a thing. It's so ironic. Yeah, the rules of engagement.
And there are no more. This is it. I mean, there's nothing else. In other words, there's no booklet that goes into further details.
They teach you a lot of technique. They teach you escalation of force. They teach you detainment procedures. But none of them are laws like this. And when I testified for Congress last week, I talked about rule of law and how the Iraqi government used the Iraqi people used rule of law. And there's no body of laws that we are enforcing when we go on our combat missions. And I held up this card, and they were like, "Nothing? You guys aren't supposed to enforce anything?" And I was like, "Well, I've heard everybody's allowed one AK per household. I've heard one AK per adult male. And I've heard so many different versions of different units. But in terms of rules, this is all we got, and this is not going to cut it." They're right.
Oh yeah.
No,
that's okay. I mean, I'm not listening to that.
This is on your website, I assume.
That's on my blog, actually.
Oh, okay.
I scanned it and it's posted there.
Good. I have to
So the title of
check.
the workshop is...
I've done some work on war crimes in Vietnam. I did a piece on how My was a direct result of the policy that Westmoreland made clear to the entire command about treatment of civilians in the hardcore, long-term Vietnam control zone. And I documented that. It's not anything that wasn't already available except for one document that I actually got from the Army archives. But I think it's the first time anybody's really put it all together to show Westmoreland clearly was responsible for the policy. They were carrying out the policy.
Like in my testimony in front of Congress, the other thing that I got to have my piece about, which was really satisfying, was about the battle. Because this was about my interpretation. I'm not really testifying, but I didn't put it in my testimony. But that from my overall understanding of the situation, the second battle of Fallujah was put off because of the presidential election, and that led to a lot of Americans dying.
That's right. It was like 3 weeks later, wasn't it? 2 weeks?
No, it was right after.
Right after.
Less than a week later.
Less than a week.
And it was something that had been postponed. And one of the congressmen who was asking the questions was obsessed with the idea of kicking down doors, and I was like, well, what you're really talking about is the second battle of Fallujah. I wasn't there. I didn't. I can't testify to that. But then he's talking about why some policies that related to what I was saying. He was like, it's not the battles of Fallujah that they were.
You're not talking about in particular.
The generals who came up with the idea, the execution battles were responsible for news surrenders. I got to say, no, that's not true. There were State Department officials there setting up the Fallujah Brigade, negotiating the process out of my facility. And even the generals who conducted these battles didn't make the policy or determine the timing. And they are pawns as much as the privates are at this point.
No, I know that was directed right from the top, absolutely.
but like even like General Petraeus, I don't think it's really. I mean, he's a douchebag, but it's not really appropriate. He's not the guy to scapegoat.
That's right.
You know, because if there were 1,000 generals, well, maybe a few hundred in the whole army that could have taken his place as a Joint Force Commander in Iraq, then he was not molded any more than any other general there, but he was selected because he has the authoritarian personality. He endorses a neocon foreign policy, and he really believes that he can do good for the Iraqi people. Like, I honestly think that he believes he's the guy that drank the most Kool-Aid. So they promoted him. He's also a fair speaker and politically pliable.
Right. And
so they picked him. They didn't create him. He's not a monster. He's not, and he really is a smart guy, and he really is a good commander. But he's I just, like he testified last time, I sat through all his hearings. I don't want to protest this guy. I want to get to the guys that are hiding behind the skirt, and he's a lot more culpable, I think, than than General Mathis, who oversaw the first battle of Fallujah. Like, General Mathis is just a fucking Marine Corps general who commands troops to execute a combat mission. Like, he doesn't,
He didn't sell policy.
If anything, he was frustrated being in a position where he was conducting an occupation in 2004. He was frustrated with that. He came up with
to do something more energetic or what?
Well, it was just he was out of place. But like he's the one that came up. He wrote the letter to the people of Fallujah that was kind of a dud, but only because of the timing. It was a good letter, and he said, you will have no better friend than no worse enemy. And he fucking laid it down and was like, we're gonna get this done and we're gonna get out of here. And he'll be, and I think he's a big part of the reason why they're trying to get the Marines out. The Marine Corps is trying to get out of Iraq and say we're going to go to Afghanistan because at least we have. I don't know what the misperception is there, but it's clear that there's this. The Marines are looking out for each other. We're trying to keep them from going to Iraq, and that's huge. But like the guys that the one the battalion commanders and the generals that were involved in like the second battle of Fallujah, they executed it pretty well based on the orders that they were given. Sure, the city. But those were totally political. It was State Department guys.
Well, you know what Jim Hoagland of the Post was saying before this, after he talked to Rumsfeld. He said, "This is going to send a message to the Sunni population that they've got to get on board, or this is what's going to happen." That's exactly what he said. That's what they were doing. And
did you see the snowflakes article? Have you heard about Rumsfeld's snowflakes?
I have heard about them, yeah.
Where was that?
There's an article that came out in the Washington Post.
Was there a Fallujah snowflake? I didn't remember.
Oh, I don't know if there's one around Fallujah, but it just sounds like one of the things he put out in the snowflake.
No, I don't remember that, but he clearly, Hoagland talked directly to Rumsfeld, and he was getting the message.
The snowflakes were these memos, essentially, these tiny memos, like 1 or 2 sentence, like maxims that if you read them, they're nuts, and they're so fascist. They're scary. Like, talking about propagandizing the entire American people type stuff, right?
Oh my God.
And, the people need to believe this in order to support the war. Like, they're really sick stuff. And he would send these out, and they would go DOD-wide within the day, right? Or Pentagon, I don't know, but like to his,
did they go to the
like
troops?
a large, no, not to any military person, I don't think, but all the DOD civilian, that part of the staff. They got all the snowflakes. And they were released. Someone saved them and leaked them.
Wow.
And a bunch of them came out, and it's just this is instead of sending like a memo. This is every time you had like a brain fart, you would write it down. It's like, you show this to everybody.
This is a power mad man, obviously.
So
what do you say?
This is Rumsfeld.
Normally I would say forget it, but you two are so important that I want to present this. So I'm just going to start.
Okay, carry on.
And what I want to do is just very briefly sort of say something personally about how I got to this. Because I was an anti-war activist during Vietnam, was against it from the beginning. That's why I decided to become a Southeast Asia specialist and went to Cornell and got my PhD there. and the system that it was based on. And I drifted, and I didn't know really what to do, and I ended up teaching at American University for a while, then drifted into the environmental movement, and then, because of a concatenation of factors, I ended up writing this book in 2005. I wrote it from 2000 to 2005 on why the United States went to war in Vietnam. And in writing that book, I began to realize that we have misunderstood what really happened to get us into Vietnam. It's always been personalized to the president, more or less, Kennedy and Johnson. And what I realized, that what jumped out at me looking at the documents, was that neither one of those presidents wanted to go to war. They knew that it was crazy, that the United States should not go to war with Vietnam, or South Vietnam. They didn't want to bomb the North. They didn't want to send troops to the South. Neither one of those things. But the entire national security bureaucracy was pushing them in that direction. I mean, essentially, with very few individual partial exceptions. The entire bureaucracy, the military bureaucracy, the CIA, the State Department, the National Security Council staff, they were all pushing in one direction, which was get troops in there, or, first to get Kennedy to put troops in, and then, after Kennedy was killed, they wanted Johnson to bomb the North. And they weren't going to do it. Kennedy tried to get out. He had his own plan to get out. I won't go into that. But the point is, the national security bureaucracy itself is the enemy. That is the problem, writ large. And this has basically escaped the whole political discussion of foreign policy, military policy, national security policy in this country. And the left is, from my point of view, has been fundamentally wrong in basically following the old left notion that it's all about economic interests. And so that's, and my fundamental message is, I drifted away from work on this problem, mainly because I did not have an analysis. I did not have an analysis that guided me to looking at what the real problem was. I was naive, I was against the war, and I understood that there were war crimes and all that, but I did not understand the underlying system at all. I did not have an analysis of it. And that's why I didn't focus on it, and that's why there was no movement, and that's why at a time when we could have basically pushed back, because the military system, the whole national security bureaucracy, was on the defensive after, in the last 5 years of the Vietnam War, basically. They were very much on the defensive.
How do the 5 years relate to when Kennedy was killed?
Well, it was basically from 69 to 75, or 74, 73, 74, 75. The whole system, the war system, was very much on the defensive. The American people were sick of the whole war. They wanted to reduce the military budget. They wanted no more military intervention. And it was a wonderful opportunity to really work on the issue, but there was no movement. There was no movement to do it, because there was no analysis. So that's where I picked this up, okay? I mean, now we're going through the whole thing again. We've got another opportunity, and there's no movement to take advantage of it yet, so this is why I'm doing the slideshow. So, to begin, the idea that I want to present, and I'm not going to try to replicate the slideshow and present it in the right order, is that we've been, in understanding, trying to explain why Iraq. There's always one or two explanations. There's the Israel explanation, of course. And I'm going to set that aside for the moment, because there is some validity to it, no question about it, that the policymakers were motivated in part by the notion that the U.S.-Israeli connection is to be highly prioritized. But I think there's something much more fundamental than that. But we've been guided, in the anti-war movement to explain this in terms of either corporate interests, that this is all in service of corporate interests, or it's to control oil, it's to control the sources. And there are a number of reasons why, to me, this is leading us in the wrong direction. I mean, in the first place, I got one word, Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam was clearly not about oil. It was not about natural resources.
Rice industry.
The rice industry, right. It was rice and tungsten, right? Tungsten and rice was what Eisenhower once talked about. And that was all bullshit, of course. I mean, that was just a way of selling a policy that could not be sold to the American people in terms of the real reasons for it. And so what do you say? Well, you know, we've got to have these resources. That's what you say. And if you go back to the Gulf War of 1991, what did George Bush 1 do? I mean, it was not, admittedly, it was not a constant theme. But during the presidential campaign, he played the oil card. He said, this is all about jobs in the United States. Why? Because, you know, if we can't get that oil, if we lose access to the oil, we lose jobs in this country. We'll lose everything. And
I said, you'll lose your job.
that's right, yeah. So it's sort of built into selling a war, that you're going to go after the jugular vein politically in this country, which is the fear of, you know, the economy is going to collapse because we won't have access to resources. And the fact is, the reality is that the Gulf War did not change the status of a single oil well, except to destroy them temporarily, take them out of, you know, it took oil off the market. Well, whoopee. Who did that help to? Who did it hurt? I mean, it hurt us. It didn't help us. Didn't hurt anybody else in the world any more than it hurt us. So, you know, there's simply no logic to the link between, you know, the first Gulf War and oil, and ipso facto, it seems to me, between the second Gulf War and oil. Besides which, you know, if you really go into it, the oil industry did not want the United States to invade and overthrow the Saddam Hussein regime. What they wanted was to make a deal with Saddam Hussein to get access to more oil. Because under the existing circumstances, in 2002, 2003, the oil industry was losing out on a lot of opportunities to exploit oil in Iraq. And what they wanted was to open up more oil for exploitation and for the market. So, you know, if you really look at their position as represented in this famous paper that was done by this panel that was at the Baker Center at Rice University, which included the former Secretary of State, James Baker. What they wanted was to make a deal with Saddam. It was exactly the opposite of the policy that was being pursued by the neocons. And then to take it a step further, to take it further into the nature of the system, you have this built-in conflict within the administration, the Bush administration, as well as previous administrations, between the interests of the military services on one hand and the people who are interested in economic policy and the corporate interests of American corporations on the other. And it's over China. China is the great source of tension within the U.S. Power structure between the military and all the interests clustered around it on one hand, and the corporate interests on the other. The corporate interests want to make deals with China. They don't want China to be demonized and made the enemy. They want to do business with China. And the military and the neocons, Bill Kristol and all those people, they hate these businessmen who want to make deals with China because they have to demonize China. That's the nature of their game. You demonize China so that you have the major power enemy that justifies the whole, traditional platforms of the military. And so that's why I think that the analysis does not really add up, which we've been it's been implicit and explicit throughout the period of the Iraq War. Now, beyond that, I mean, the problem with this analysis is that politically it disempowers activists. Because when you are targeting U.S. Corporate interests, a class interest, if you will, as the enemy, and you make that the definition of the problem, what's the solution? Well, there's no solution except to end capitalism in the United States. But the last time I checked, that revolution's not around the corner. And so, the activist and potential activist population of this country, which is really quite significant in terms of the number of people who understand that the Iraq War is a terrible idea and even a criminal idea, and that something needs to be done about this kind of war. I mean, it's a tremendous potential for activism there in the population. Millions of people. I mean, let's not try to figure out exactly how many millions, but millions of people are clearly and even in 2003, when the war started, even before it went sour, there were millions of people who were opposed to it. But they're really disempowered by this explanation, by this line of analysis, which says that the war system is really about economic interest or corporate interests of American corporations. Because it leads to the conclusion there's nothing to be done. There's no strategy that it leads to. There's no political strategy that it leads to, except to be against corporations. And that simply does not translate into a doable political strategy in this country for the foreseeable future. So my main argument is that, one of my main arguments, is that we have to have a different analysis to empower activists in this country. And what I was laying out in this slideshow, which has gone sour, it's apparently corrupted and so can't show it, is to lay out an alternative analysis, a line of analysis, which I think can be translated into a political strategy. And I'll try to do that in sort of very briefly. So that's why I'm suggesting there is no movement at this historical juncture to really attack militarism and the system itself. Now, let me just briefly define what I mean by militarism and the war system. By militarism, I mean a system that shows three fundamental characteristics. It has three symptoms, if you will. First, military dominance everywhere in the world, not just dominating the entire world, but every region of the world, every part of the globe, has become an end in itself. And it's an explicit end. It's the explicit objective of U.S. military policy. It's no longer just, sort of an end to justify the means, or means to justify the end, excuse me. It's no longer the means to justify the end. It has become an end that justifies the means. And this has happened since the end of the Cold War. It happened on Bill Clinton's watch. It happened during the 90s. The sort of a creeping process of sort of formation of military doctrine. But it's one of the most important things that's happened in terms of national security policy and military policy since the end of the Cold War, that dominance became the explicit objective of U.S. global policy. The second point, of course, and none of this is new to any of you, is that the United States has forward deployment everywhere in the world, military bases and troops and naval and air forces stationed everywhere in the world so that U.S. forces can be thrown into battle at a moment's notice in a huge, range of scenarios for which there are a huge range of war plans. And then the third key point, and I just select these out because they seem to me to symbolize the nature of the system, not because that covers the subject by any means. The third point is that the military policy is explicitly one that is based on going first, striking first, not sort of counterattacking after someone else has committed aggression. I mean, this has become the official military doctrine of the United States everywhere in the world, that we are prepared to strike first. So it was not just the neocons that dreamed up the idea of striking first. This had become increasingly, since the end of the Cold War, a central part of military doctrine. More and more of the war plans were plans that envisioned the United States striking first. And that's what, a huge part of the military system now is built around the idea that we have to be able to attack a particular country. We have to be able to put our forces into a particular country without regard to what the circumstances are, under any circumstances. We have to be able to do that. And so it's essentially a system that is aimed at getting us into more and more wars. I mean, it's built for that purpose. And therefore, it is a system for perpetual war, essentially. And this has been building up gradually, consistently, over decades, essentially. This is a process of accretion of power. And I would argue, and I will argue in explaining the system, that the key problem that we have faced, that we are facing today, and that has built up over the last few decades, is that the U.S. military at one time, no doubt, was an arm of corporate America. In Central America in the 20s and 30s, that's what it did. It enforced the writ of U.S. corporations who had interests in Central America, for example. So there's no doubt in my mind that that analysis was perfectly appropriate for that period in that part of the world. But from early in the Cold War, I think the evidence is compelling that the U.S. military bureaucracy achieved autonomous power, completely separate from, had no tie, meaningful tie anymore with corporate interests. And from then on, from really the beginning of the Cold War, the U.S. military bureaucracy, 3 military services specifically, had their own bureaucratic interests. They had their own institutional interests, which guided them in terms of their choice of military strategy, the kind of war they wanted to fight, the kind of military doctrine that they adopted, the kinds of roles and missions that they adopted for the service, and therefore the kind of foreign policy that they wanted the United States to follow in different parts of the world. And post-World War II, of course, this was particularly important in East Asia, because the United States ended up, after World War II, in command of the Pacific, all the way from the Northern Pacific down to the South Pacific. The Pacific became the American Lake. It already was, essentially the American Lake before the Japanese caused trouble. But then after the conquest of Japan, it became even more completely U.S. military dominance throughout the Far East. And there are several cases that I want to highlight where the military has played the key role in shaping broad national strategy, which either continued a Cold War policy or created a new Cold War policy. And I want to mention several of these key episodes that to me help to buttress the notion that the military bureaucracies, the 3 service bureaucracies, are the absolute epicenter and the dominant part of the national security state, and an autonomous power which has their own interests and are capable and have the strong will to maintain and enhance their power. The first one has to do with the Navy and China. It's very well documented, and I'm going to write a book about this. That's why I've done the research on this. It's very well documented that after World War II, the U.S. Navy was promised a naval base on the mainland of China by Chiang Kai-shek. And that was the prize, that was the jewel in the crown for the U.S. Navy, to have that naval base on the mainland of China. And of course, then the Chinese Civil War displaced Chiang Kai-shek in 1948. 49, 50 was, I guess it was October 49. The Chinese Communist regime took power. That game was off. But the Navy did not give up. They wanted that base on the mainland of China. And the Navy became the primary driving force behind the U.S. policy of supporting Chiang Kai-shek to retake the mainland and preparing for war with Communist China, if necessary. And of course, the Navy had all its war plans. The Air Force supported the Navy. They became the key sort of alliance there in the military services, driving this policy of basically overthrowing the Chinese Communist regime, which became the fundamental Cold War policy of the U.S. and Asia. It shaped everything else. Once that policy was established, once China became the enemy, and the policy of overthrowing the regime became the official U.S. policy throughout the Eisenhower regime, that drove everything else in East Asian policy. And it became then an objective that each successive U.S. administration supported, even though John F. Kennedy, before he was elected, he knew that was wrong. He knew that we had to get out from under that somehow. But he was totally opposed by the national security bureaucracy. He knew it. He couldn't do anything about it. He had to play ball on that issue. So that's the first. I mean, so the Navy was pushing for war with China. They pushed for war with China through the 1950s, into the early 1960s. This is well documented. They were the primary driving force behind that. But the Joint Chiefs, because the Air Force supported them, the Joint Chiefs then supported that policy, and it became a very firmly established U.S. policy throughout the Eisenhower administration, even though Ike and John Foster Dulles were opposed to it. It was still the military policy of the United States. The second episode is Vietnam. I talked about that already. I mean, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, as well as Eisenhower, all three presidents were firmly opposed to fighting over South Vietnam. But by the early 1960s, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had decided that they wanted to get troops into South Vietnam. The Army was badly in need of a new mission. They'd been looking for a new mission ever since Eisenhower sort of clipped their wings, took away most of their budget, and really, pissed off the Army brass. Eisenhower managed to piss off all three services, basically, but the Army brass was as pissed off as anybody, I think. And when Kennedy came in, one of the things that happened was Maxwell Taylor became Kennedy's primary, he was his military advisor soon after he came in 61, 62. And Taylor, of course, was the leader of the Army brass who wanted to carve out a new role, which was fighting these peripheral wars, these small wars around the periphery against people other than the Soviet Union. I mean, that was the wave of the future for these guys. They wanted to create a new mission for the Army. So Maxwell Taylor was, more than anybody else, pushing for sending troops to South Vietnam. That was his way of giving the Army a new mission, which they badly needed. And so Taylor was one of the leaders of this cabal. This was the version of the neocon cabal that existed during the Kennedy and Johnson period. There was a cabal of officials around Maxwell Taylor and a few people in the State Department left over from the Eisenhower period, right-wingers in the State Department, people in the CIA, right-wingers in the CIA, and the Joint Chiefs, all of whom were pushing for sending troops. So my point is that there was this cabal pushing for war in Vietnam that the presidents knew was a terrible idea and tried to resist, but the pressure grew and grew and finally got to LBJ. And I talk about this in the book that I wrote called Perils of Dominance. It was published in 2005, which documents how we went to war in Vietnam. And for the first time shows how much pressure was put on both of those presidents by this cabal of officials, really covering all of the major national security agencies. And only a few individuals were kind of saying, well, it's not particularly a good idea. But basically, they were institutional interests that were very powerfully behind this. The third point, the third episode, is what happened about the missile gap. I mean, I think most of you know the missile gap is a total fiction, which was perpetrated by the Air Force. I mean, it was a strategic policy by the Air Force to perpetrate the missile gap myth. They did so knowing perfectly well that it was false. Within the intelligence community, the Air Force intelligence people inflated the figures about future. It had nothing to do with existing missiles. It was missiles 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years into the future, which nobody had any notion, what that might be. They inflated their estimates by a factor of 100. I mean, they were just completely off the charts. And all of the rest of the military intelligence people and the CIA knew that it was completely phony. And they fought it. But the Air Force had allies in Congress, and they used these allies to make leaks and to tilt the balance within the administration. And they basically neutralized the CIA. They made the CIA scared. The CIA sort of then stepped back and said, well, it's not our call. We're not going to call these estimates on future Soviet missiles. And so the Air Force was riding high. But then something happened technologically, and they got the capability to actually look in through satellite photographs, and they could tell what was actually going on. And they could see that there weren't any missile emplacements. They could see that they were nowhere close to where the Air Force said they were. And so the missile gap collapsed. And JFK knew within weeks of the time of his taking office that missile gap, I'm sorry, before he took office, he knew the missile gap was a myth. In fact, the missile gap was a missile gap in favor of the United States. So when they really had very, very firm intelligence by the end of 2001, Kennedy got the idea that since we now know for sure, and there's no, I mean, the CIA issued an NIE confirming this, National Intelligence Estimate confirming this. Kennedy then, in early '62, I believe it's spring of '62, issued an order, instruction, to the entire national security community, demanding that they, now that we know the missile gap is a myth, and that in fact we dominate in terms of strategic missiles, why do we have to continue the present level of the arms race? Why can't we reverse the arms race and have a different policy? So he wanted a complete review of the arms race in light of the fact the missile gap was in our favor. And so he ordered a review, and what do you suppose happened? All of the agencies ganged up and agreed that there's no need to make a single change. Everything should just remain the same. And so, once again, the politics of this are, I mean, Kennedy obviously wanted to reverse the arms race. He understood what needed to be done. But the entire national security bureaucracy was against him. And the politics of this were such that a president in a Cold War situation, confronted with a united national security bureaucracy, has a very tough time standing up and saying, I'm going to fire all these people and get new people. Well, the new people are going to have the same institutional interests. They're going to say the same thing. He's not going to come and tell the American people, we have a problem here. We have a national security bureaucracy that has its own interests. And, you know, they're insisting that we continue this Cold War, but I know better. You can't do that.
Yeah.
Well, okay, he didn't have the cojones. All right, I mean, you know. I mean, that's the flip side of it, of course. He was a Paul, and you could argue that he did not have sufficient principles to stand up and, you know, and take the risk, the political risk, which went with that. Some people argue, of course, that he was killed because of his opposition to the military. I don't buy that. I'm not buying into that. But no, there's no doubt that he was up against concerted pressure, you know, to do certain things and resistance to doing things that he wanted to do across the board, on Laos, on Vietnam, on the arms race, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, I mean, there's the whole narrative on that underlines the power of the national security bureaucracy, and, you know, time and again how they have shaped the policy through their insistence that we have to move in a certain direction. Well, the final episode that I want to mention, of course, we have to mention what happened after the Soviet Union disappeared, and the military bureaucracy and its civilian allies simply recreated themselves and said, okay, we're going to go on simply as though nothing happened. I mean, I believe it's the case that there was a 15% reduction in military budget after the Soviet Union disappeared. Temporary reduction, 15%. But no essential roles and missions were scrapped. The same roles and missions. Institutional interests remained the same.
Same targets.
Same targets, exactly. Nothing changed in terms of the basic military strategy. So essentially, the most important change in international politics in 60 years. Sorry, 50 years since the end of the Cold War, since the end of World War II, made no difference to the U.S. military services and the national security bureaucracy. Then the final episode I want to mention is how Rumsfeld was essentially, Rumsfeld bought into an Air Force idea of how to make war on the cheap. Quick, cheap war with a small footprint.
High-tech.
High-tech, small footprint war, footprint meaning ground forces. And how the Air Force, after the Gulf War, first Gulf War, got the idea that we'll exploit our success in the Gulf War to have this new doctrine, new military doctrine of this small footprint, high-tech war, quick in, quick out, with minimal ground forces. And this will be a way of allowing the next Secretary of Defense to be able to get all those high-tech weapons, those high-tech playthings, without busting the military budget. And so they would get what they needed, and would be at the expense of the Army. And of course, this is exactly what Rumsfeld needed, because Rumsfeld came into office, he didn't have a clue about military forces. All he knew about the military was what he learned as chairman of the Rand Corporation's board of directors. Hardly anybody knows this, but Rumsfeld was head of the Rand Corporation's board of directors for 15 years after he left the Pentagon. Total of 15 years. He was briefed twice a year at their meetings on all the work the Rand Corporation was doing on military strategy, military policy. Now, of course, you know the Rand Corporation is an arm of the Air Force. So everything he learned in those 15 years was coming directly from the Air Force point of view, because the Rand Corporation is not going to do anything that's not cleared by, paid by, and watched over by Air Force brass. So Rumsfeld essentially got his cues, got his notions about fighting wars and how to jigger the military budget from the Air Force. And so Iraq is really, not just an Air Force war in the sense that the Air Force went in and bombed and paved the way for the occupation, but the whole idea of how to do that was an Air Force doctrine, which they assiduously developed in the early to mid-1990s. And there was a huge fight. Of course, the Army they understood what was going on, and they tried to fight back, but the deck was stacked against them, and the Air Force managed to get this into some doctrinal papers, and it went fairly far by the time that the Bush administration came into power. So, it's not well known, but I think the story of Iraq is really, to a great extent, the story of how one service is more powerful, more influential than the other services in terms of the crucial question of how does the United States fight these kinds of wars in the Middle East, where it has to overthrow a regime, but it's not prepared to really spend any money on it, because it's going to do this a number of times. It's not going to just do it once. It has to do it in ways that are replicable. In other words, this was the idea was that it's to be a replicable war. We can do it several times. And because it's going to be quick in and quick out. I mean, there was never supposed to be an occupation. That was not part of the scenario, because they had no idea what they were into. But the idea of fighting that kind of war was an Air Force idea.